Get this man out of my seat. Whatever confusion there is, it ends now. I have a committee meeting in Ottawa in 4 hours. The conductor standing in the aisle of Via Rail's business class car looked from the woman to the man she was pointing at, and for a moment the right answer seemed obvious. The man's boarding confirmation was printed on cardstock, folded once with the seat number legible from 2 feet away. Car 14, seat 3A. The woman, Lorraine Channing, whose name appeared on the provincial re-election fundraising posters Daphne Selkirk had seen plastered across Union Station's east corridor, held a ticket that said 5C. The right answer lasted about 4 seconds. Then Daphne noticed the Legislative Assembly crest embossed on the leather portfolio under Lorraine's arm and remembered the regional service directive circulated the previous spring. Priority accommodation for government and corporate VIP travelers when operationally feasible. She looked at the man's jacket, the kind that had been laundered often enough to fade at the shoulders, and then at the small girl sitting in 3B who had stopped coloring in her notebook the moment voices rose. Daphne made her decision. Nolan Bassett had not planned to be the center of anything that morning. He had planned to get Iris to Ottawa with enough time for a proper breakfast before her audition at the National Youth Music Conservatory at 10 o'clock. He had planned to sit in the back of the small rehearsal hall and watch her play the piece she had been practicing since February. He had planned, maybe, to cry a little where no one would notice. He had not planned on Lorraine Channing. He had booked seats 3A and 3B 3 weeks earlier, the afternoon the conservatory emailed to confirm Iris's selection into the regional round. He had never purchased business-class tickets on Via Rail before in his life. But Iris had a mild case of motion sickness that worsened in the economy cars farther back, where the sway between the rails was more pronounced, and she needed to arrive in Ottawa calm and rested. He had used the last of his overtime from the previous quarter to cover the difference. The tickets were legitimate. He had confirmed the booking 4 times before leaving the apartment. Iris Bassett was 8 years old and carried herself with the careful seriousness of a child who had learned early that adults did not always behave the way she had been told they would. She kept a dark green notebook in her lap, full of musical notations and pencil drawings of birds she had spotted from apartment windows over the years. When Nolan settled into 3A beside her and fastened her seatbelt with the same automatic tenderness he'd been repeating since she was 2, she had immediately opened the notebook to a fresh page and begun drawing the CN Tower receding behind the train as it pulled away from Union Station. For 11 minutes they were fine. Morning light came sideways through the window. Iris hummed something under her breath. The opening bars of the piece Nolan recognized, though she wasn't aware she was doing it. He closed his eyes for what felt like the first time in days. Then Lorraine Channing walked through the car door. She came with the particular energy of someone who expected obstacles to dissolve before she reached them. Her ivory blazer was tailored to the shoulder. Her hair was arranged without a strand out of place. Behind her, a young assistant followed with 2 bags and the embossed legislative portfolio. Several passengers straightened in their seats without knowing why. Lorraine stopped at row 3 and looked at Nolan the way someone looks at a piece of furniture blocking a doorway. "This is my seat," she said. Nolan glanced at his boarding confirmation, then at her. "I have 3A confirmed. The reservation was made 3 weeks ago." Lorraine did not look at his paper. She looked at Daphne, who had appeared in the aisle with the careful smile of someone trying to preempt a scene. "There appears to have been a booking error," Daphne said, though she had already reviewed Nolan's confirmation and found nothing wrong with it. She had also reviewed Lorraine's ticket, which clearly listed 5C. "We'll need a moment to sort it out." "There's nothing to sort," Nolan said quietly. "The ticket in my hand has a confirmation number and a seat assignment. Both are correct." Lorraine's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted into a harder register. "I had my office contact your corporate line last week to arrange front row business class. I was told it would be accommodated. A phone request doesn't override a confirmed reservation. I don't have time for a debate about process. I'm meeting with the federal transport minister in 3 hours. She looked at Daphne again. "Handle this." Iris had stopped humming. She watched Lorraine with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite confusion. Something between the two, the particular look a child makes when the world stops matching the version of it she was taught to expect. Daphne bent her head toward her tablet and began entering something. The screen tilted away from Nolan before he could read it. "I can offer you row 8, she told him. 2 seats together, still in business class." "Our seats are here," Nolan said. "Row 3, that's what I purchased. The system may be showing a discrepancy we need to resolve." The system isn't showing a discrepancy. She has a different seat number. That is not a discrepancy in my booking. Daphne's professional smile held, but the warmth left it entirely. She lowered her voice. Sir, I need you to cooperate so we can move forward without delaying the service. There are passengers on the platform still boarding. Nolan looked at Iris. Her notebook was closed now. Both hands were in her lap. He did not want to frighten her. He did not want the morning to collapse before the most important audition of her short life. But he also understood, with the particular precision of someone who had spent years in situations where it mattered whether information was accurate, that surrendering to a procedure that was being invented on the spot was not the same as keeping the peace. He asked Daphne to show him the current booking status for seat 3A. She said the system was updating. He asked who had authorized any modification to his reservation. She said she was managing the situation. He asked whether Via Rail's own passenger care guidelines permitted separating a minor child from her parent without documentation. That question made Daphne pause. It also brought Bruce Oland, the station customer experience manager, who arrived from the platform with the expression of a man interrupted mid-coffee and already annoyed about the interruption. Daphne reached him first and spoke for 2 minutes before Nolan could say anything. She described the situation as a duplicate booking error and Lorraine as a priority government traveler with an active service arrangement. Bruce did not ask Nolan for his confirmation number. He did not pull up the reservation history. He looked at the legislative crest on Lorraine's portfolio, looked at the faded shoulders of Nolan's jacket, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the documentation in front of him. Via Rail reserves the right to adjust seating in exceptional operational circumstances, Bruce said. We'll get you situated in row 8. There's a travel credit we can apply toward your next. I don't want a travel credit. I want the seat I paid for. Sir, Bruce dropped his voice to the register men use when they want to imply a consequence without technically stating one. If you continue making this difficult, I'll need to contact station security. I don't think either of us wants that delay. Lorraine folded her arms and watched with the patient satisfaction of someone watching a known outcome arrive on schedule. Nolan looked at Daphne's name badge. He looked at Bruce's station ID. He stored both names in the part of his mind that did not drop details. Then he looked at Daphne's tablet, angled entirely away from him now, and noticed that the seat status display for 3A had changed. The indicator was different from what it had been 3 minutes ago. He stood. He helped Iris with her coat. She did it quietly, asking nothing, which was harder to watch than if she had cried. He retrieved her notebook from the tray table and tucked it into her backpack. He lifted his carry-on from the overhead rack. Lorraine stepped aside just enough to let him pass. Next time, she said, not troubling to lower her voice, book a seat that reflects your situation. A few passengers glanced up. One studied his phone. No one said anything. Nolan did not answer her. He and Iris moved through the car toward the vestibule at the rear of the business section. The door slid shut behind them. They stood between the cars. Station sounds came through the walls, doors sealing, platform announcements echoing through the main hall. Iris stood close to her father with both hands gripping the straps of her backpack. Her chin was down. After a moment, she looked up at him. Did we do something wrong? She asked. Nolan crouched until he was level with her. He put one hand on her shoulder. No, he said, we did everything right. Then why did they make us leave? He looked through the small window in the vestibule door at the business class car. Lorraine had settled into his seat by the window. Daphne was speaking to her with the attentive posture of someone trying to repair a relationship. Because some people believe that if they make enough noise, no one will stop to check whether they're right, Nolan said. But they were wrong. You had the ticket. They knew that. Iris was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you say who you are? You could have. Nolan looked at her. He could feel his own heartbeat. The same deliberate calm he practiced in the field when everything around him was failing, and the one thing he could control was the speed of his own decisions. Because if the only reason they treat us fairly is that I have a particular job title, he said, then they don't actually believe we deserve fair treatment. They believe titles deserve it, and that problem doesn't go away just because we walk off this train with our seats back. Iris considered that, but it would have worked today. Today, for us. He looked at her steadily. There would be someone else tomorrow, someone without a title. She pressed herself against his arm and held on. Nolan straightened. He watched through the window as Bruce confirmed something on Daphne's tablet and handed it back to her. He noticed that the seat display had changed in the past several minutes. Not just moved, reclassified. The status code beside his name now appeared to indicate a passenger-initiated transfer, as though he had requested the change himself. He had signed nothing. He had agreed to nothing. He had stood because a station manager had threatened to involve security. He turned to the young conductor standing near the vestibule wall, a trainee whose badge read Seth Dalgetty, and who had the look of someone who had witnessed something he hadn't been sure what to do with. Nolan asked quietly whether the modification had been entered as a passenger-initiated change. Seth looked at the door. Then he said, "I'm not sure I'm supposed to." "I'm not asking you to confirm anything internal," Nolan said. "I'm asking whether anyone asked me to sign a form or recorded my consent before the change was entered." Seth said no. Before either of them could continue, the vestibule door on the platform side opened. Murray Tait stepped aboard. Murray was Via Rail's Regional Operations Director for the Ontario Corridor. He was conducting a scheduled review of the morning departures and had been told Car 14 had a boarding issue. He expected a paperwork conflict. He expected a scheduling gap. He came through the door already composing a resolution in his head. He found Nolan Bassett standing in the vestibule holding his daughter's hand. Murray stopped. He had spent 28 years in railway operations and had developed the instinct of reading a scene before he had full information. He looked at Nolan. He looked at Iris. He looked at the visible discomfort in Seth's posture and at the business class car door. "Director Bassett," he said carefully. The words had the sound of someone quietly revising everything they had assumed about a room. "What are you doing out here?" Bruce Oland had followed Murray aboard. The explanation he had been forming stopped before it started. Daphne appeared in the car doorway. She saw Murray addressing Nolan with the particular deference of someone speaking to a federal superior. The color left her face the way color leaves a room when the light shifts. Inside the car, visible through the small window, Lorraine Channing was still checking her phone. She had not yet understood what was happening outside. Murray turned back to Nolan. "Tell me what happened." Nolan didn't answer immediately. He asked Murray calmly whether he could first answer 3 procedural questions. Murray said yes. Nolan asked whether a Via Rail conductor could modify a confirmed passenger reservation without documented consent. Murray said the answer to that was clearly no. He asked whether a station manager could authorize a seat reassignment separating a minor child from a parent without recording the operational justification. Murray said that required a signed form and a supervisor's co-signature. He asked whether a train with an unauthorized modification to its passenger manifest could depart in compliance with Transport Canada's current safety framework. Murray was quiet for 3 seconds. He already understood what that question meant. He took out his radio and made 3 calls, the first to the departure coordinator, the second to Via Rail's regional compliance deputy in Ottawa, the third to the station superintendent. When he was finished, he told Bruce not to touch any device and not to approach Seth, and to wait where he was. Bruce's jaw moved without producing sound. 5 minutes after Nolan had been walked out of his seat, the public address system in Car 14 activated. Passengers were informed that the service would experience a mandatory delay pending a passenger records verification. All passengers were asked to collect their belongings and disembark to the platform in an orderly fashion. The reaction moved through the business class car like a cold front. Several passengers assumed a mechanical fault. Others whispered about a security concern. 2 of them started recording on their phones, the same ones they had been studying carefully during the confrontation at row 3. Lorraine stood when the 3rd announcement came. She told Daphne the delay was unacceptable. She said she had a federal ministry meeting and that if Via Rail caused her to miss it, there would be consequences of a regulatory nature. Daphne nodded without speaking. It was no longer a performance of composure. It was the silence of someone who had begun, fully, to understand what they had done. The passengers filed out. Lorraine was last, walking with the rigid posture of someone refusing to show that anything had changed. When she stepped off the train, she stopped. Nolan was no longer alone with his daughter. Murray stood beside him. 2 compliance officers had come from the station offices. The station superintendent waited nearby. Seth Dalgetty stood slightly apart, holding his company tablet with both hands. Several of the passengers who had watched Nolan leave his seat without raising his voice now stood on the platform studying the assembled officials and quietly revising the story they had been telling themselves for the past 20 minutes. Lorraine's gaze moved across the group. She found no one in it looking at her the way people usually did. The compliance review was conducted at a portable workstation set up at the end of the platform under the station overhang. Murray stood with the two officers while the original reservation records were retrieved. The data was unambiguous. Nolan's reservation for 3A and 3B had been confirmed 3 weeks earlier. Payment cleared, no flag, no duplicate, no error. Lorraine Channing's reservation, made through the Ontario Legislative Assembly's travel desk 4 days prior, showed seat 5C in business class. There was no record of any phone request for a seat change, no supervisor approval, no operational note. What the records did show was a modification entered under Daphne Selkirk's employee account at 8:47 a.m., 14 minutes before scheduled departure. Nolan's seat had been reclassified from confirmed to voluntarily transferred. The system code used, code 7 for passenger-initiated accommodation, required a digital signature or written waiver from the passenger. Neither existed in the file. One of the compliance officers asked Daphne when Nolan had indicated his willingness to transfer. Daphne said she had taken his decision to stand up and move toward the vestibule as an indication of acceptance. The officer said Via Rail's own guidelines defined acceptance as a documented act, not an inference from physical compliance under threat of security removal. Daphne said she had been under pressure and trying to manage the cabin without creating a scene. The officer asked why she had not examined the boarding confirmation Nolan had offered her. Daphne did not answer. Bruce said the situation had been a reasonable judgment call under time pressure and that he had approved Daphne's action in good faith. Murray asked whether Bruce had reviewed Nolan's original reservation before approving the change. Bruce said he had relied on Daphne's description of the situation. Murray asked whether he had documented the reason for separating a minor child from her parent before authorizing the modification. Bruce said there hadn't been time. Murray said there was always time to document the reason for separating a child from her parent. That was precisely why the requirement existed. Seth raised his hand. He had a photograph. He had taken it on his tablet during boarding, when the car's display system had briefly glitched, and he'd been uncertain whether the screen would recover in time. He had photographed the seating chart as a backup reference for meal requests and passenger names. The image was time-stamped 8:33 a.m., 14 minutes before Daphne's modification. It showed 3A and 3B assigned to Bassett N and Bassett I. It showed 5C assigned to Channing. He had a second image taken after he'd noticed the display had changed. The difference between the two was visible and complete. Seth also said, more quietly, and with the careful tone of someone choosing to say a difficult thing, that he had been standing near the front of the car when Lorraine had spoken privately to Daphne before the confrontation began. He had heard Lorraine mention that the provincial government's infrastructure committee would be reviewing Via Rail's capital funding request at the end of the quarter. She had suggested, specifically, that staff who understood the priorities of important travelers tended to be remembered in those conversations. Daphne looked at the platform floor. Lorraine stepped forward. She said Seth was mischaracterizing a passing remark. She said she had never asked any employee to falsify a record and had only expected a reasonable level of service accommodation. She said the investigation was a gross overreaction to a minor seating inconvenience. Nolan looked at her. His expression carried nothing personal in it. A child was separated from her parent, he said. A confirmed reservation was falsified. A voluntary consent code was applied to a forced compliance. Those are not questions of service quality. They are questions of whether the records on this train reflect who is actually on it, and whether any of us are safe when they don't. I had nothing to do with the records. Your request created the conditions under which the records were changed. Whether you made the decision directly is what the investigation will determine. He paused. The investigation that is now going to happen. Lorraine turned to Murray. She reminded him that the provincial government had considerable influence over Via Rail's annual infrastructure allocation. She suggested that elevating a seat dispute into a formal compliance proceeding would be viewed as a significant overreaction, particularly when the individual escalating the matter stood to benefit from making a public official appear negligent. Murray looked at her, then he looked at Nolan. Nolan said, "A service arrangement that requires employees to override passenger safety guidelines is not an arrangement worth maintaining." The compliance review's findings were forwarded to Via Rail's National Passenger Rights Office before the next departure was organized. The conclusions were not gentle, and they were not slow. Daphne Selkirk was relieved of duties pending a full investigation. She had applied a voluntary transfer code without documentation, moved a minor to an unaccompanied record status without guardian consent, and invoked an accommodation policy that had never been formally approved for unilateral application by frontline staff. She had 11 years with Via Rail. That fact was entered into the record. It did not change the record. Bruce Oland was suspended from all supervisory functions for authorizing a manifest alteration without reviewing source documentation, for failing to document the separation of a minor, and for approving a change without a recorded operational justification. Murray also requested a review of Bruce's complaint history, which surfaced 2 earlier passenger disputes involving seat reassignments, both closed without interviews, both marked resolved under Bruce's own account credentials. Seth Dalgetty was formally commended. Murray recommended him for Via Rail's Operational Leadership Development Program and noted in writing that Seth had preserved material evidence under social pressure and had spoken truthfully when doing so carried real professional risk. That, Murray said in Nolan's presence, was rarer than most organizations wanted to examine too closely. Lorraine Channing's Via Rail Priority Traveler designation was suspended pending review of her involvement. A formal notation was added to the provincial government travel desk file. Accommodation requests made through informal channels would no longer be actioned without written authorization from a designated liaison officer and confirmation from a senior Via Rail manager. Before the replacement service was organized, Nolan stood with the displaced passengers on the platform. He did not speak as the Federal Director of Emergency Operations for Transport Canada, though some of them had worked that out by then. He spoke as one of the people who had been asked to leave the train. He apologized for the delay. He said the service had been held because the passenger manifest had been altered without authorization, that a seat assignment was not a preference or a formality, but a record tying a person's identity to their location on the vehicle, and that falsifying it was a failure that mattered whether anyone caught it or not. He said the disruption was real, that missed meetings and rescheduled plans were real, and that Via Rail would be providing full refunds, meal accommodations, and rebooking assistance for every passenger affected. He said one other thing. He said the situation had not been corrected because he had a federal appointment. It had been corrected because a junior conductor with no seniority, no protection, and nothing to gain had decided that what he'd seen was worth writing down, and then worth saying out loud. A few passengers looked at Seth. Seth looked at the concrete platform. When the replacement train was confirmed and the queue began to form, Murray had arranged for Nolan and Iris to have their original assignment reinstated. 3A and 3B, confirmed and restored. Nolan stood at the edge of the platform for a moment. Then he noticed an older man on the station bench near the entrance. A man who had been in the business class car earlier and who moved slowly with a cane, and who was now trying to work out on his phone whether his Ottawa hotel would hold his reservation given the delay. He was alone. He had the look of someone who had decided a long time ago that complaining rarely produced results worth the effort. Nolan walked over. They spoke briefly. Then Nolan found one of the Via attendants and quietly arranged for the man and his cane to take seats 3A and 3B on the replacement service. Murray came to offer an alternative business class arrangement. Nolan said no. He and Iris found 2 seats together in the standard car about halfway down. The seats were narrower. The sway when the train pulled out of Union Station was more noticeable. Iris pressed against the window and opened her notebook to the drawing she had put away when Lorraine Channing walked into the car. She picked up her pencil and kept going, the CN Tower from memory now, smaller and farther than she had drawn it the first time, the track running out ahead into the corridor east. "Will she get in trouble?" Iris asked. She didn't say who she meant. "Yes," Nolan said. "Good." She kept drawing. "Is it bad that I think that?" "No," he said. "Wanting consequences to exist isn't the same as wanting someone to be hurt. It's the same as wanting the rules to mean something." Iris was quiet for a while after that, working on the drawing. Outside, the last of the city was giving way to the wide, flat fields of the Ontario corridor. The same land the railway had been crossing for well over 100 years, back when people had first agreed that a country this wide needed to be able to move through itself. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her shoulders. The train settled into its rhythm, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. They arrived in Ottawa 19 minutes late. Iris had enough time for a glass of water and to warm up her fingers in the washroom before the audition. She walked into the hall the way she walked into every unfamiliar room, with the careful, quiet determination of a child who had already met harder things earlier that same morning and was still standing. Nolan sat in the back row and watched her take her place and begin to play. He had spent years in emergency work developing one particular instinct above all others, identifying what actually mattered in a situation, not what was loudest, Not what arrived with the most authority, but what was true and what would hold when everything else was stripped away. The instinct had served him in a lot of difficult places. It had served him that morning in a railway car he had legally paid to sit in. But what he kept returning to, watching Iris play, was Seth Dalgetty standing in the vestibule with a tablet and a photograph, making a decision in a moment when no one powerful was watching, and the easier choice was clearly to look the other way. Real authority, Nolan had come to believe, did not announce itself in advance. It didn't arrive in tailored blazers or with legislative crests. It showed up in the small private decisions a person made alone, to document what was real, to name what was wrong, and to remain standing when stepping aside would have cost them nothing and saved them everything. The last note settled in the hall. Iris lowered her hands and waited. Nolan exhaled slowly and let himself be proud.